So welcome back. So on the first day of the course, we have 4 longer lectures, 1.5 hours. So you got the introduction in the morning, then you'll have symmetric key cryptology, then in the afternoon public key cryptology, and then I'll come back and I'll teach about authentication and key establishment protocols. So I now hand the floor to Dr. Tim Beyne, who has jumped in last moment because Professor Raymond could not be present due to personal circumstances, but I'm quite sure Tim will do an excellent job. Tim, you have the floor.
Thank you. So yeah, I'll be talking about symmetric key cryptography, and I'm not Vincent, like Bart said. So this also means that these are not my slides, and they're actually also based on older slides from Bart. So symmetric key cryptography is really sort of the workhorse of many of the other things that you will see later in this course. And in this talk, I mainly want to talk about sort of the classical use cases of symmetric cryptography, which are providing confidentiality, so encryption, and providing authentication. And of course, so this is not everything that symmetric cryptography is used for. You will see actually probably in the next few days that there are many cases where you use them in a different way. So for example, if you want to generate randomness, you would also use symmetric cryptography. So let's get started with encryption. So Bart already explained sort of the basic setup. So we have in this setting 2 parties with a shared key, and they want to communicate in such a way that an eavesdropper cannot intercept their communication. So yeah, there is an eavesdropper, which we often call Eve, and can see all the messages that are on the communication channel, but also potentially modify them. We will get to that more when we talk about authentication. So the basic idea to make this possible is, of course, the classical idea of encryption. So you take your plain text message, you do some operation on it to scramble it into ciphertext, and then Bob needs to be able to unscramble that. And of course, this crypto box has to be somehow secret. Yeah, because otherwise anyone can unscramble. And so that's where this key comes in. So this key is what we assume is a shared secret of the 2 parties. And so one of the basic principles is also that all of the secrecy comes down to the secrecy of the key. Yeah, so the crypto box itself, how it works, can be publicly known, but the key should be secret. Okay, so that's the very basic principle. So first of all, let me start by telling you that there is actually a perfectly secure way to solve this problem. And it's very simple. It's called Vernam's one-time path. So suppose that I have a very long stream of random bits. Now I can encrypt my message, my plaintext, by just taking 1 bit of the plaintext and XORing this key stream bit to it, and that resulting bit will just look like a uniform random bit. So it doesn't reveal any information about my message. And this is actually perfectly secure, of course, assuming that we have this perfectly random string of bits. Yeah. Now, what's the problem? In practice, yeah, you need, for this to be actually secure, you need a key stream, which is just as long as the message. Yeah, and since we're probably going to encrypt many gigabytes of data, that's completely impractical. Yeah. In fact, it's better to think of this maybe not as a perfectly secure system, but instead as a way to reduce the problem of encryption to the problem of generating a long stream of random looking bits. And that's also what actually happens in a stream cipher. So a stream cipher is basically a way to start from a short secret and then generate a long key, you can think of it, or a long key stream, as we call it. And you do this using an expansion algorithm, basically. So often in cryptography, we like to draw block diagrams of how these algorithms work. So here's a finite state machine that shows how such a stream cipher works. So you start with an initial state. I will come back to this later, it's quite important. And this will depend on certain constant, which is not actually a constant, but it's called an initial value, and on the key. And then you have this state update function, so which takes your current state, and each time that you want to produce a next output bit, you clock, we call this clock, this state machine, which means you take the state, you apply this function, and this gives you the next function. And the output that you get is produced by taking the state and applying a certain function to it. Yeah, so it's quite simple. And then you get, so the output here of this algorithm is this Z, that's the key stream. Yeah, so this gives us something, this Z should look basically like perfectly random. Yeah, it's not actually perfectly random, of course, but it should look like that. And then we XOR this to the plain text, yeah, bit by bit. And that's the ciphertext. And if you want to decrypt, yeah, you just need to run the same process here to generate your output bits, and then XOR this to the ciphertext. Yeah? Because if you XOR a value with itself, it's always 0. Yeah? So this decryption process and encryption process are exactly the same. But it's of course important that these two functions or algorithms here are perfectly synchronized. Right? So they need to start from the same state, and then each time that you produce a new output bit, they need to clock in a synchronous way. Because of course, when there's a difference in the number of times that you've clocked, then this decryption will go wrong. Okay, so what's a problem with this kind of designs? If you use the key stream more than once, then this is broken. Yeah. So maybe going back here. So imagine that I just start from this IV and key, yeah, and I produce my key stream, and I get encryption. And then later I want to encrypt another message, and I just start from the same IV and the same key, who produce exactly the same key stream. So that means that there is a relation between the ciphertext for the first message and the ciphertext for the second message. And so if I XOR those together, actually the key stream, which is the same, will just drop out. Yeah, and so this leaks the difference, or the XOR difference, between the two messages. Yeah. So that's a big problem, because in many cases, actually, this plain text is quite redundant. Yeah. So you can imagine that just from knowing the difference between the two plain texts, you can actually recover what the plain text must have been. Yeah. So that's something we need to avoid, and that's where this initial value comes in. So this initial value essentially is there so that when you want to encrypt a second message, you can essentially use a different initial value so that you are sure that the key stream produced will also be different. So there are basically two ways of ensuring this. So one is you can just take a random IV. Yeah. Then it needs to be long enough, because it could be otherwise by chance that two IVs happen to collide. Or you could just choose the IV always in a stateful way so that you never repeat it. Yeah. And that's actually a principle in modern cryptography. We realized at some point that in order to build secure encryption, you either need some form of randomness or statefulness. Yeah. Otherwise, you cannot really prevent this kind of an issue. The benefit of stream ciphers basically comes from the fact that you can make this initialization very expensive, yeah, and that helps to make it secure. But then the producing just one output bit can be made very cheap. Yeah, so you always have this, initially you have to put in your key in the state and your IV, and so there you do some setup phase. This can be very expensive because you only need to do that once per message. Yeah, but then later on you can just generate the key stream pretty fast, because the idea is at that point the adversary cannot control the state anymore. Yeah? So that's a potential advantage of stream ciphers. So now let's take a look at how this state update function is actually constructed. Yeah? So a first starting point could be to use a linear state update function. And one very popular choice historically has been the use of LFSRs. So what's an LFSR? So you have a state which, so looks something like this is a state. Let's say that each of these cells here is 1 bit. And a state update function for an LFSR just takes a few of these state bits and then XORs them together. And this becomes the new last state bit. And then you shift this whole LFSR by 1 position to the left. Yeah, so, and this is, you can see that this is a reversible operation. Yeah, because even though we remove that bit, you can compute it back from knowing this new bit. Yeah. So that's what an LFSR does. This is, by the way, there are 2 types of LFSRs. There's Fibonacci LFSRs and Gawa LFSRs. This is a Fibonacci type LFSR. There's also another type, but I will not discuss it. So what is nice about LFSRs is that there's quite a lot of theory about their properties. Yeah? So for example, if you want to know the period of the LFSR, yeah? So if you start from an initial state, you're going to produce next states, but at some point you could get back to the original state, yeah? And then your key stream actually will start to repeat, which we don't want. Yeah? So you need to ensure that you have a long period. Yeah? So for LFSRs, there is a nice theory that you can use to predict exactly what the length of this period will be. The problem with an LFSR is that it is linear. So if I just directly extract some bits from this LFSR state as my key stream, it's very easy actually to recover the state because you can just solve a system of linear equations. So that's why all actual stream ciphers need to introduce some nonlinearity at some point. And there are 2 basic ways to do this. The first is that you still use an LFSR for the state update, but then you extract the output using a nonlinear function. Yeah, this is sometimes called a filtered LFSR. And it's quite often not just one LFSR, but you have several LFSRs that you combine, and then you take a function of the outputs of the states of all those LFSRs that's nonlinear to produce the output. Another approach is to use just a nonlinear feedback shift register. So that means we take some bits from these step positions, as we call them, but instead of just XORing them, we can compute some nonlinear function and use this as the feedback. But it's, of course, much more difficult then to analyze what, for example, the period is and so on. So you really need a lot of cryptanalysis theory to be able to see if such a thing is secure. So I'll now give a few examples of stream ciphers, but please don't use any of these because they're all broken, but they've all been historically important. And actually, so stream ciphers used to be very popular, then they became not so popular anymore. One reason is many of them got broken. Very recently, there has actually been new interest in stream ciphers because of other applications such as fully homomorphic encryption, but we'll get to this at the very end, maybe. So this is a stream cipher called A51, which was used in the GSM standards. Actually, GSM standards have a lot of stream ciphers that, well, all of them or almost all of them are broken. So there's also GEA1, GEA2, GEA3, all quite similar. So this is A51. What does it do? So actually it's 3 LFSRs in principle. And then the output is just, you take 1 bit and so the bit that's shifted out, you XOR this and that's your output. That would be linear, of course. So I already discussed that's bad. So how to make this non-linear? So what this cipher does is it doesn't always clock. So it first takes these 3 bits and computes the majority of those bits. Yeah? So the majority is just if 2 or 3 of these bits are 1, then the majority is 1. And then it only clocks, for example, this first LFSR if this bit is equal to the majority. So let's suppose the majority is 1, then it only clocks if this bit, this 8 bit, is actually a 1. Yeah, and because the majority is a nonlinear function, yeah, that ensures that this update is actually nonlinear. Yeah, although it's actually 3 LFSRs, but they're just not always clocked, depending on a condition. So that's A51. Another example, which is a little bit different approach, is the Bluetooth stream cipher E0. So here you have 4 different LFSRs of different lengths. And you also have this nonlinear thing here. Yeah, so this is doing some nonlinear operations. And then the output is, so you take the output of the LFSRs, you XOR it, but you also have this nonlinear feedback shift register here, which you also XOR. And this gets input from the LFSR output as well. So that's again another way to introduce nonlinearity. But so, yeah, this may look, it looks quite complicated actually, but it's not really as secure as you might think. Yeah? But then to understand why, you really need to go deep into the analysis, yeah? Which of course is not the goal of today's presentation. Then a final very important example of a stream cipher, also not secure, is the RC4 cipher. So this is, RC stands probably for Ron's cipher. So it was designed by Ron Rivest for RSA Security, the company. It was initially not public, but at some point someone posted the algorithm to a mailing list, and then it became, I mean, it was no longer a trade secret. And this is a bit atypical, so it works essentially by creating a random permutation or shuffle. So we will, so first, based on the key, we're going to create a kind of random shuffle. And then based on that random shuffle, we have a way of producing the key stream. So I'll first explain how this random shuffle S is produced. Yeah, so this is a table with 256 numbers in there. Yeah, so the idea of this is I can take an input and then look up in the table the corresponding value. So that's the same as saying I have a way to shuffle these 256 values. And the goal of this initialization phase is that if I have a random key, this is more or less going to produce a random shuffle. So how does this work? So I start by initializing my shuffle just as the identity. So that's just not random, of course. And then I do 256 steps. And so each step, I will take the key. Yeah, so that's just a master key. Yeah. And then I use this key. So I take the ith byte of the key together with what is currently in my current shuffle, plus a current indexing variable j to produce a new indexing variable. And then I will basically take position I and position j in this table and swap them. Yeah, and this swap depends on the key. Yeah, that's the essential thing. So and then you repeat this several times, and you hope that if you do enough swaps, this S starts to look like a random shuffle. So once we have this S, we can start generating a key stream. So here, the basic idea, so you have the current index. Yeah, so each time that we produce one output byte, this is going to be incremented. So you take this, so initially, so the next output byte, we increment this I. And there is also this internal variable j, which depends on the secret. And so what we will do is we will use this index I to look up in our S, combine this with j to produce a new index, and then again we're going to swap. So this is the state update. Yeah? The state, you can think of this S is really the state, and we're just going to do a swap. Yeah, so you take the index j, this is the new j, and then we do a swap between these two values. Okay, and then based on these two values, we also produce the output. Yeah, so you compute first the sum modulo 256, and then you look up this sum again in the table. Yeah, so that's the sum of 162 and 92 is 254. And then you look up there, so 99 is the key stream byte that we produce. And then this thing is repeated. Yeah, so that's how it works. Now, I already said RC4 is not actually secure. And there are several issues with it, actually, not just one. One issue is that this initial setup, so where we created the table S, yeah, well, if you take a random key, yeah, that it should produce indeed something that looks like a random shuffle. But if we already fix in advance some part of the keys, so we essentially restrict to a class of keys with certain special properties, then it turns out that that shuffling doesn't really create completely random shuffles. And this is a problem. There's another issue, which is that the output bytes produced by this process here, yeah, aren't exactly uniform random, which they should be. Because if you're going to XOR this to the message, if it's not uniform random, you leak actually something about the message. And so there has been a lot of analysis about this, and yeah, this is actually what also led to actual attacks. But another problem is also more general. So this was some very early design, and it didn't have an IV yet. And so you see already the problem, because how do I now start a new encryption? Because then if I do that and I just use the same key, I will just produce the same key stream. So we again have this problem that we're reusing the key stream. So the solution that people then come up with is, well, we have to somehow use a different key each time. So you actually end up using part of the key as the IV. But that's not how it was really intended, because once you choose part of your key as the IV, you actually, as an attacker, know part of the key. Yeah, or sometimes you can even control part of the key. And this actually led to some protocols like WEP that was, RC4 was used there. So this is like this old Wi-Fi protocol. RC4 was also used very widely in TLS at some point. Yeah, but not today anymore. So now let's turn to the second approach to this encryption problem, which is the block cipher-based approach. And this starts a bit from another direction, namely a substitution cipher. So it's a very classical way of doing encryption. So basically, I have a small table which is secret. And whenever I want to encrypt a message, I just take one of the letters of my message. So for example, let's say my message is bad. Then I will look up in this table what the corresponding letter is. And so that's maybe I, for example. And then A, it becomes U, and D becomes D. So it's a very simple substitution cipher. So the idea is that if this table is sort of random looking, this provides some security. Unfortunately, it's known already for a long time that this approach is completely broken. And why is that? Because basically in English, in all languages really, not all letters are equally frequent. Yeah. There's the idea of frequency analysis. So if you actually look at English texts, what's the distribution of letters? For example, the E is much more common than most other letters. So if I often see the letter R in the ciphertext, I can actually figure out that R must have corresponded to E. Yeah, so that doesn't work. But actually the idea of block ciphers is nonetheless still the same. And sort of the next iteration on this idea of a substitution cipher is that, well, if we just, instead of substituting one letter at a time, let's just take a whole block of letters and then substitute that. Because now the frequencies of these blocks are much more evenly distributed. So that makes it, if they're very big, much harder to actually figure out this table. And so this is actually called a code book. Yeah? And in the past, a code book was literally a book with basically for lots of different phrases or blocks of letters, you would have a corresponding ciphertext. Yeah, and so if you wanted to encrypt something, you take your code book and you just look up and then you replace it. The problem is that in order for this to offer any sort of security, these blocks must actually be very large. And then the problem is that how can I actually store all of that? Yeah? Because if these blocks are very large, then my book needs to become very long. And so the modern solution to that is that instead of storing this huge table, you actually make an algorithm that replaces this table. Yeah? So basically, we have now only a short key. And then based on this short key, we try to compute the corresponding entry of this table with some algorithm. Yeah, so now we only need to store a short key. That's much more practical. But of course, this only works if your f is chosen so that the table that you generate actually looks like a more or less random table. Yeah, otherwise, you again run into problems. And so this f is what we call a block cipher. Yeah, so it's an algorithm that basically an algorithmic version of a code book. So in practice, how do you build a block cipher? So yeah, it has to be, of course, secure, as I said, but also this has to be sufficiently fast. Yeah, and yeah, so that are some constraints. And there was early on a proposal already by Shannon, so the founder of information theory, for how you can do this. Yeah, and his idea was, I mean, he compared it actually to a baker who makes bread. So what you do is you kind of do different operations on it, and you alternate these operations, but these, I mean, so there are operations that do not commute with each other. So his proposal was something like you first do some simple operation, like which is called an S-box typically, but doesn't really matter. So first operation, which is local, so you just do something local on your thing that you are mixing, and then after that you do something simpler, but which is more global and sort of mixes the local parts together. And this is the idea that if you do that sufficiently often, you will mix your dough of the bread well enough. That's the basic idea. So that's, if you do this literally like that proposal, it's not actually secure yet. Yeah, of course, well, it depends on what you do exactly here, but if this is small, this local operations is not actually secure yet. So the solution to that is just to repeat this many times. You need to repeat it. And one repetition is called a round. So then we talk about rounds of a block cipher. So this leads to a typical design that's called an iterative cipher. So what does the iterative cipher do? You have a master key. From the master key, you deduce round keys. So those are actually going to be the keys used in each of these round transformations. So we'll see later concretely how it works for some examples, but basically do one round with the first round key, do another round with the second round key, and so on. So most actual block ciphers are based on two different architectures. One is the Feistel cipher and the other is the substitution permutation network. So Feistel cipher looks like this. So here there is, your state is always split into two branches. And you just take one branch, you apply a function to it, which is not necessarily an invertible function. And you add this, and add means typically XOR, this to the other branch. And then you swap the two branches. Now, what's the interesting feature of this? Well, this construction is always invertible. You need to have an invertible function because you want to be able to decrypt. Because from one half, you can always, okay, this half is just equal to that. If you want to compute back the other half, you can just take this half, use it to compute this function, and then subtract it from this to get back to the input. So that's clever construction to essentially turn any function into some invertible function. And yeah, so this is also nice because if you want to do decryption, it actually looks exactly the same. So the decryption operation and the encryption are the same. Which means that if you want to, for example, implement this, you only need to implement it once. And especially in the past, that was something that was kind of convenient. Actually, already with systems like Enigma, that was also the case. So it's quite a popular principle to have a system where you can do encryption and decryption with the same hardware, basically. So then the second approach, as mentioned, is the substitution permutation network. This is a little bit misuse of this term. So the actual, like a very typical substitution permutation network takes, so you split your state into small blocks, you do a substitution, like one of these one-character substitutions on each part, and then you just shuffle them here. That's an actual SP network. But in modern ciphers, this shuffling is actually more complicated than just shuffling. So we more generally will have something here which is a linear function again. So yeah. The main, so okay, this is how you do it in general, yeah, but then you still need to decide how you actually choose those substitutions, so those blue boxes, and how you choose the green boxes, yeah. And that's, yeah, there is a lot of possible choices, and you really need cryptanalysis techniques to see what is a good choice to make this actually secure, yeah. And also to see how many times we then need to iterate this before it actually becomes secure. Okay, so now I'll get into an actual example, which will be the AES. Yeah, so this is really the most widely used block cipher. Yeah, everyone is using this all the time. So this is an iterative cipher. So we have a round function and a key schedule. I'll mostly get into not the key schedule, but just the round update function. So the round function looks something like this. I mean, I will give a different description of it later, but so you have this substitution permutation ID. So this, as those are substitutions on 8 bits. So you have, usually, I mean, for the actual AES, 128 bits. Yeah, so you split them into blocks of 8 bits, and then on each 8 bit you do a certain substitution. Then you see there is a permutation of those bytes, and then you do something linear. So this is going to be something linear. It's called mixed columns for a reason that I'll come back to in the next slide. So every block cipher, of course, has on the one hand a block length and on the other hand a key length. Yeah. In the case of the AES, there is actually more than one possible key length. Yeah, so you can have either 128-bit keys, yeah, or yeah, so 16 bytes or 24 bytes or 32 bytes. And then depending on how long the key is, the number of rounds is different. Yeah, so you need a bit more rounds if your key is longer. The block length of AES is always 128 bits, but actually, so AES is derived, or is actually the same as Rendau, which was what actually was submitted to the NIST competition for at the time. And Rendau actually also supports different block lengths. So you have, again, 16 bytes, 24 bytes, or 32 bytes, in addition to this key lengths. But only the one with a 16-byte state was standardized, although actually NIST is now going to standardize only now actually the one also with 32-byte state. Because we'll see later that sometimes 128-bit state is a bit small for some applications. Okay. So I had this picture of AES, but now I'm going to represent the state in a slightly different way. So before we had these 16 bytes all laid out like next to each other. But it's actually a lot easier to describe what happens if I put them in a square. So I just put these in a 4x4 square or array, and then the different operations are going to operate on different parts of this array. So Each round contains substitution, permutation, and this mixed column. So the first thing I'll look at is a substitution. This just takes one byte of the state and applies this lookup table, essentially, to get an output byte. One thing that's already worth mentioning is, so in the past, there used to be a lot of ciphers that had the idea of, let's use for every byte a different, or for every substitution, a different substitution. Yeah, so you have all these different tables, which makes it very complicated. Whether it actually makes it more secure is not so clear at all. So in AES, there is only one substitution. So it's always the same substitution, which makes it a lot simpler. Simpler to understand and also to analyze. So this substitution is actually not just arbitrarily chosen. There's some mathematics behind this. What basically happens is the substitution is obtained from an operation in a finite field. Yeah, doesn't really matter if you're not familiar with finite fields, but it's basically inversion in a finite field. So finite field is like a number system where you can calculate, you can add numbers and multiply them in a way that is very similar to how you can add regular real numbers and multiply them, but only with a finite number of elements. And by choosing it in that way, so choosing this inversion, turns out to give very good properties against specific attacks. So I will not actually go into attacks today, but for example, there's attacks like linear and differential cryptanalysis. And how strong a cipher is against these attacks depends on the overall structure, but also on the specific choice of your S-box. And so this choice actually leads to very good properties, nearly optimal properties for such a for this choice. And it also has good, so there's another technique called integral cryptanalysis, which has to do with writing your function as a polynomial, and you would want this to be a high degree polynomial. And this S-box also has that property that actually this is the case when you choose it like this. It's not exactly just inversion, but it's actually inversion with some additional linear thing applied after the inversion. Yeah, that's a bit more complicated to see why that is really necessary. And I think actually at the time of the design, it was not really clear that it was actually necessary. So that's the S-box. So now, first I'll do the more complicated of the two linear parts. So there is the linear part, which is just a shuffle, and there is the thing which was this mixed column on the previous picture. So when we represent the state as a square, a mixed column is actually very easy. So you take each column, and then on each column independently, you apply a certain linear transformation. So a linear transformation is given by multiplication by a certain matrix. And again, it's linear with respect to this finite field. So it's actually, this is a matrix over a finite field. So this 2, 3, 1, 1 are not really what you might think they are. They're not actually the numbers 2, 3, 1, 1. They're actually elements of this finite field. They're just a representation of that. But you multiply each column, and then you get a new column. And this matrix here, this matrix that is used here, is chosen in a very special way. Again, because this gives us better resistance to linear and differential cryptanalysis. It's really optimized for that. And there's a relation in particular with MDS codes, but I will not really explain cryptanalysis, so it doesn't make sense to really go into details. So then we still have this byte shuffling, and if you look at it from this point of view of a square state, it's again very simple. So what you do is actually you shift each row. So the first row is not shifted, I mean it's shifted by 0, but then, or shift or rotate I should maybe say. So this is rotated to the left, so then G goes there. The important part of this is that whenever you have, when you look at one column here, after you do shift rows, each of the bytes here ends up in a different column. That's again necessary for security. So that's all the operations, except that we still need to mix in the key. Yeah. So the round keys need to somehow be mixed in, and that's just done, like in many ciphers, by adding the round key to the state. So adding again means XORing. So you have your 128-bit state, you XOR the 128-bit round key. The round keys are also derived from the master key, because the master key is only 128 bits, for example, but we need, for each of the 10 rounds, a master key, actually, a round key. So you have to have another algorithm for that, but I will not show it here. So now something just a bit for amusement, as a small break maybe. So if you have this square, yeah, you can always roll up this square into a cylinder and then fold the cylinder, deform it into a torus. Yeah, so why do I say this? So basically, once you think of the state as a torus instead of as this square, then you can have a slightly nicer view of the operations of the AES. So yeah, of course, subbytes is not so special. It's just each byte is still just replaced. But shift rows and mixed columns become slightly nicer because they're now local operations. So in mixed columns, for example, you take each byte and then you can replace it by just a combination of its neighbors. Yeah, it's just something for amusement. Okay. So now I've discussed how you can make a block cipher and what a block cipher is, but there is still a question of how do we actually use a block cipher to do encryption. Yeah, so it turns out it's not as easy as you might expect. Yeah, so the easy thing would be you just take your message, you chop it up into blocks, and then you apply the block cipher to each. But that turns out to be not a good idea, and I will explain soon why. So this how to use a block cipher for encryption, that's called a mode of operation. So it's like a construction you build around the block cipher, and for most of these modes of operation, we can do a sort of security proof. Of course, it's not an absolute proof of security. It just means that if we assume the block cipher does not have any flaws, which basically means that it behaves exactly like a completely randomly generated codebook, then this mode of operation will be secure. That's the form of this kind of statements. So it basically means that this way of using the block cipher does not generically lead to an insecure system. Yeah? If you have a secure cipher, you can actually use it. So, like I said, the simplest way that you might think of to use a block cipher is to chop up your input into blocks and apply the block cipher in parallel. But this is not secure, and the reason, or one reason you can see, is if I take P1 equal to P2, I will always get C1 equal to C2. Yeah, and why is that a problem? And this is often illustrated with this penguin. So I have a picture here of a penguin, and then I encrypt it. But now, so it means I first split this picture into blocks of 128 bits, right? And then each of those blocks is encrypted separately. But there's a lot of white background here, for example. So every white block is just mapped to, yeah, it's not going to be white, but something else. So if you look at the overall structure, you actually can still recognize that it was a penguin. Yeah. So that's kind of visually clear why you should never use ECB. So what can you do to do it in a secure way? There are several proposals, and I'll just give a few examples. First one is CBC. So what do you do here? So you, first of all, you start by introducing again this initial value. We already had it with stream ciphers, and I mentioned there, in order to have secure encryption, we actually need either randomness or a state. Yeah, and this is why we have this initial value. So either this, yeah, so here you just take a random IV. Yeah, so we always need something like that, because otherwise, if we encrypt two messages, we're going to actually produce the same result, which you don't really want. So what you do here is you take always the plain text, you add the previous ciphertext to it, XOR again, and then you encrypt, and this gives you the next ciphertext. And this you can show that it's secure up to some number of queries that you can make to this construct, so some number of encryptions that you can do. You cannot do arbitrary many encryptions with this. There is some limit on that. And in this case, the limit is about, so if you have an n-bit block cipher, you shouldn't use it to encrypt more than square root of 2 to the n blocks. So why is that? Basically, if I have around 2 to the n over 2 blocks, yeah, that gives me, so 2 to the n pairs of blocks. Yeah. So that, and the chance that 2 n-bit blocks collides is about 2 to the minus n. Yeah. So you have 2 to the n pairs of blocks, with chance 2 to the minus n they collide. So there will be, on average, you expect one colliding block. Of course, I mean, that also happens for a random stream of bytes. Yeah, that's not the problem. But what happens is, once I have a collision between two ciphertext blocks, this is an invertible function. So the AES it's an invertible function. So if the outputs collide, their inputs also must collide. So that means actually that Pi XOR whatever this comes in must be equal to Pj XOR this previous ciphertext. So you get this relation, yeah, and this actually leaks the XOR between two plaintext blocks. Yeah, so you see that basically you should not use it for too many blocks, otherwise you get a collision and you will leak information. So that's a typical issue that you have. Essentially, we are using this AES, and we would want to actually have here a random function, but it's a random permutation. This causes this problem. Another mode of operation, and this is actually much more popular nowadays than the previous one, is called counter mode. And what does counter mode do? Well, basically it takes the block cipher and essentially builds a stream cipher from it. Because, so here we don't put the message plaintext on the input of the block cipher. So instead we start with a counter. So let's say initially this is 0, but actually it should also, you should start from a different counter actually for each message. Yeah? Otherwise, I mean, you need this statefulness, otherwise you would just produce the same outputs here. And then you each time increment this counter, yeah, and apply the block cipher to produce a block of key stream bits, and you XOR. So this updating of the counter, you can think of that actually as a feedback shift register again. Yeah. So it's essentially a way to make a stream cipher from a block cipher. What's nice about this is that you can very easily parallelize this. Yeah. Because it's easy to compute a few of these counters, and I can apply in parallel the block cipher, and this can be very fast for both encryption and decryption. So before we continue, just a summary of the two methods of doing encryption that I discussed, so block ciphers and stream ciphers. So as I said, stream ciphers used to be very popular and then became much less popular. But recently, there's been actually a few new stream cipher proposals also. But overall, block ciphers are currently much more widely used. So it's really used not only actually for encryption. So in the second part of the talk, we'll see also some examples of how you can use block ciphers for authentication. So they're more, they're more widely used at the moment. For stream ciphers, it's also, so there is quite a lot of theory about block ciphers, about their cryptanalysis. Yeah, all of that I cannot discuss today. For stream ciphers as well, but so for LFSRs, it's quite easy to tell what's going on. And once you start using an NFSR, it's a nonlinear feedback shift register, it gets much more complicated. Okay, so now let's get to the second part, which is authentication. So what's the basic problem? So yeah, encryption hides the message that you're sending, but it could be that someone on the channel actually just modifies what you're sending. Yeah, you can just take your ciphertext, flip some bits, And if you think about a stream cipher, for example, where you just XOR the message, that's a big problem, because if you flip a bit in the ciphertext, and I don't know that this happens, and I decrypt, then I will also get a flipped bit in my message. Yeah, so if it's a bank transfer, yeah, and it's saying I transfer you €1, and I just, as an attacker, flip, I know more or less where this is going to be set, because it's a standardized message. I just flip this highest bit, suddenly I will transfer much bigger amount. So that's a problem that needs to be solved. And so the authentication basically allows us to check that the message was not modified and actually comes from the other party who has the secret key. So, like I said, so encryption basically allows us to protect the message, and this protection ultimately depends on the secrecy of a short key. So now we want to do the same for authentication. And the way we will do this is you will create for your message, which can be very long, a short fingerprint. Yeah. And if you want authentication, this fingerprint, which we call hash also, or compute this fingerprint using a hash, should somehow depend on the key, so that someone who doesn't have the key cannot produce a valid fingerprint. And somehow this fingerprint should be tied to the message, yeah, in a way. Okay. So I will first explain this, so the idea of hashing, and this can be with or without a key depending on the application. So this is this function that creates a fingerprint of a long message. So you take your message, and then there will be some kind of algorithm that produces a very short output that we call the digest. So the length of the output depends on the algorithm, but it's a fixed length usually, yeah, compared to the message, which can be very long. And again, we have same requirements as for block ciphers. They should be fast, and they should be, of course, secure. And what do we mean by secure? Depending on the application, that can be several things. So the first security criterion that you might want is pre-image resistance, which, well, if I'm going to apply this to my message, well, my message is actually secret. So knowing the digest should not reveal what my message was. So that means it should be difficult to compute backwards. Yeah. So given the digest, I have to find a message that corresponds to that. So that should be a difficult problem. Of course, if this is much longer, this is generally not unique, but the security property we really want is that you shouldn't be able to produce any input that will give this digest. A second property is a bit more subtle. It's called collision resistance. So here the problem is, what if the attacker can produce a second message with the same fingerprint? So, yeah, if I have, for example, some document, yeah, and it says that I will do something, I will transfer some money or whatever, the attacker shouldn't be able to produce another document that says, for example, another amount of money, which will have the same digest, because that would be a problem. And so to do that, so the mathematical problem is to find what we call a collision. Yeah? So it means you take two different messages, so that if you hash them, they give a equal digest. So we don't want this to happen. And so that's, well, of course, to be clear, such pairs of messages must exist, because there are much more messages than there are possible digests. Yeah. But we want this to be difficult to find, even though it exists. So to make this a little bit more formal, so we had the pre-image resistance problem, yeah, which is if you have the digest, it should be difficult to compute an input x, so that the hash of x is equal to the digest. There is also a variant of that, which is a bit stronger. So here you are given already an input, x, and its hash. And then you should find another input, x prime, with the same hash. Yeah. So it's a bit similar to a collision resistance, but you actually need it to be a specific hash of another input. Yeah? So it's it's much more difficult generically than this collision problem, which is to find any two inputs with the same hash. It's quite easy to see that if you want to have collision resistance, so this implies actually preimage and second preimage resistance. Yeah? So because if I can find preimages very easily, yeah, then I can just find a collision also. Just find two different preimages, and then I have a collision. Yeah. So before we go into how you actually concretely build a hash function, you can look at how difficult are these problems actually if I don't know any details of the hash function. So for the case of second preimage and preimage, this preimage problem, well, the simple thing that you can always do, regardless of what the function is just exhaustively try all the possible, well, not all, but many possible messages until you happen to have an output that matches the digest that you want. Yeah, and the chance that if you have an n-bit digest, the chance that your output will match it is 1 divided by 2 to the power of n. So after trying 2 to the n, or actually 2 to the n divided by 2 different inputs, you will probably match. Yeah. For the collision attack, you can again use the birthday problem, which we already saw in the context of the encryption modes. So here you can just take a set of square root of 2 to the n different messages, but that gives you 2 to the n pairs of messages, and then each pair has a probability of collision of 2 to the minus n, so you again expect to find a collision. So collisions are much easier in terms of relative to the output length than preimages. So hash functions actually, there are different things that are all called hash functions, but actually quite different depending on whether or not they have a key. So you have, and I'll discuss each of them. So you have something that's called universal hash function. So this is a hash function that is used with a secret key, but the secret key should only be used once in principle. Then you have message authentication codes, which is actually what we want for authentication usually. So you have it's essentially creates a digest in a key-dependent way, but with slightly different requirements on the security. And then you have also unkeyed hash functions. Yeah, and you'll see, for example, in public key cryptography, you often need such an unkeyed hash function to create, for example, signature schemes. So to make a signature. You will see more about this later. So how do you make actually a hash function? So usually, because the message can be super long, but it's not really easy to make an algorithm that directly operates on this super long message. So again, there's going to be this principle of splitting it into blocks, doing something with each block. And in particular, we will use a building block that we call a compression function, which will take an input that is just slightly longer, but still of fixed length, and produces a shorter output. But both of the input length and output length will both be fixed. And then you combine those compression functions, and there are several ways to do it. There is what is called tree hashing, I will show it, and then there's also Merkle-Damgard. So the idea of tree hashing is like this. So I have here a compression function, for example, that takes 2 n bits and produces always n bits. So what I can do is I can split my message into blocks, and then take each pair, apply this function, so this will compress it to half the length, then do another layer of this, and continue like that. This is not actually used that commonly, but it's a kind of intuitive way of doing things. More common is what I call Merkle's methods. So here you basically start again from initial value, but this initial value is a bit different from before. Now this is actually just going to be a constant. And then what you do is you take the initial value and you take your first message block, you produce a first output, H1, this is often called the chaining value, and then you take this chaining value and you combine it with the second message block to produce the next chaining value, and so on, until at the end you get the last chaining value, and this will be the output. You should usually use a slightly different function for the last block. Why is that? Well, if I actually know the output for some particular message, I can easily extend this into another message. There's not always a problem, but sometimes a problem that I can just, because I know the output, so I can just add a new block, I know the chaining value, I can produce the output. And this is a problem when, for example, suppose that M1 is actually something secret, and we'll see later examples where this is how it's used. Then I can actually produce a valid hash, even though I don't really know the full input. So it's called length extension. So this is why you usually use a different last block. One bit subtle issue is our message can be an arbitrary number of bits, but we need to split it into blocks. But then, how do you do this when the number of bits is not a multiple of the block size? And so then you need to use padding. You could think, just add zeros, but if you do that, how do you distinguish between a message that actually just ends in zeros, and one that was padded? Because that would give you trivial security problems. So you need to think a bit about this, and what Mirko and Damgaard showed is you can use the following padding scheme. You always add a 1, and then you add zeros until the next block length. And this turns out to be a secure padding scheme. You also want to add some encoding of the length, again, for this length extension. So now I said how you can combine these compression functions. The question is still, how do we actually build the compression function? And here, it again turns out we can start from block ciphers. And so you see this is a very versatile primitive, and use them to build a compression function. Other times it's just a dedicated function, but I'll focus on how to build it from a block cipher here. So one first way, which is actually used by a number of popular hash functions, is the Davis-Mayer construction. So what does it do? So you have a block cipher. This is the block cipher. And it has also a key schedule, which I put outside of the box here. And instead of using, so normally this would be the key, but now we put the message block there. So we have our chaining value and our message block. So now we're actually going to encrypt the chaining value with, as the key, this message block. So this will produce something that is shorter. And then you to make this non-invertible when you, because you can, if you know this, you can compute back. So to prevent this, you do a feed forward. So that's the Davis-Mayer construction. There are also some other variants that you could think of this. So there is, for example, instead of putting the key, the message as the key, you can also put the message at the input and then use the chaining value as the key. And then, so this is very similar, but also with the feed forward. You can also add another sum, another XOR, or it can be also modular addition, between this chaining value and the output. So those are three commonly used approaches of turning a block cipher into a compression function. I have to say though that usually if you take really an existing block cipher and just directly put it in this kind of constructions, it's not going to be secure. Because if you think, for example, about this construction, here now the attacker controls the message. Usually that's the key, so the key is not controlled by the adversary. So it's a very different setting for your security analysis. So you often need to take that into account when you actually design this block ciphers, if you want to use it as a compression function. So that's what is meant here with a non-standard assumption. Standard assumption is you have a key that is not controlled by the adversary. So one other problem is that if you think about like a cipher like AES, and if you use, so it has a 128-bit state, and now I want to use it as a compression function, that's actually not so good, because you will have a 128-bit output, but collision resistance was 2 to the power of the output length in bits divided by 2. So that's only 2 to the 64, which is actually not that high. So you really would need also block cipher with a long block length for this. And it may also be, because in a block cipher, usually it's designed so that the key schedule actually can be quite expensive, because you only need to do it once in the setup. But here, if you're using the message as what is normally the key, you actually need to compute this key schedule many times, and this is actually not what it was intended for. So that can be quite slow. So some examples of block cipher-based compression functions, and then hash functions. So you have MD4 by Rivest. So it looks exactly like this first construction that I showed, the Davis-Meyer construction. And so you have here a particular state update function that looks more specifically like this. So this is 48 rounds. Well, they call it steps, actually. I mean, it's a bit different terminology, but it's 48 rounds. They come into 3 blocks of 16 rounds. And in each of these 3 blocks, there is a different function f here. And this function f is kind of a bitwise function. This MD4 was completely broken. So that's just. But there were other designs based on MD4. So there was first SHA-0 and SHA-1, and those are also broken. So I mean, especially for collision attacks. And there is also SHA-2, which is still very widely used and not yet broken. But so all of these. They look quite similar, but you see also here, this was a quite small state. We have moved also to bigger states. And that's also because of the need for just you need generically a big state to prevent collision attacks. Also more recently, well, it's not that recent actually, but the latest standard for hashing or for general purpose hashing is SHA-3. And it works quite differently, and maybe if there is time, I'll get into it a bit at the end. So it's not based on a block cipher, but just on functions f, which are permutations. So they're not actually compressing. This is just a permutation, this f. But instead, you take your message, you split it into blocks, and then in each step, you will XOR one block to part of this state, apply the state update function f, and you repeat this, and then at the end, after absorbing all the message blocks, you extract a smaller number of output blocks. But so this is, you're not extracting the full state, so you cannot compute back. You only extract a part. Okay, so now how you can use this for example, authentication of messages. So the idea is, if I have 2 messages that are even slightly different, I should get a different hash. So if you use a hash function, this is not key dependent, right? So this is just a public value. But so if you want to use, that's fine. If you can have a secure channel, you can use that for authentication. But if you don't have a secure channel, you would need to compute a keyed hash. So to get you a tag which someone who doesn't have the key cannot compute. And that's what a message authentication code does. It's a bit like a hash, but with a key also, so that someone who doesn't have the key cannot compute it. And so what do you need for a Mac? So you want, of course, that nobody can just search for the key, so your key needs to be long enough. Yeah, you can just try different keys, yeah, and see if you get this relation between this input and this digest, and if it matches, you will know that the key was correct. And another attack that you can try to do, but it's much more difficult usually, is you can just try to make a random tag and then hope that it matches, it's actually a correct tag for the message. And how difficult this is depends on the length of your tag. So if you have an n-bit tag, again, you have to try this 2 to the n-1. But the problem with this is it's more difficult because usually if I'm trying to do this on an actual system and the verification of the tag fails, they will not allow me to do this again an arbitrary number of times. So this will be limited by the server or whatever that is. So that's an online attack, so it's much more difficult. But this exhaustive key search, of course, can be done. So the consequence of this is the tag length, yeah, it can be much shorter than the key length usually. Yeah. Okay, so how to make such a MAC, so message authentication code. So yeah, you could do it based on a hash function. We'll see that in a few slides, but you can also directly do it based on a block cipher. So this is, for example, CBC MAC. So CBC MAC takes your message. So let's say it's P1, P2, P3. You split it into blocks. It's a bit like the encryption mode we saw before. But what you do now is instead of producing ciphertext here, you do this until you get the last block, and then you select, for example, half of this as the tag. Yeah. So that's a secure MAC based on a block cipher. You can also use a unkeyed hash function to build your MAC. Now, what is an easy way to do this is you take your message and you would prepend the key to it. Just put the key and then your message, and this actually would be fine, except that many of these, especially older hash functions, had this length extension problem. Yeah, if you remember, if we don't do anything special on the last block, you can just, if you know the hash and there is a secret key prepended to it, you can just, from the hash, actually compute, so that's the next chaining value. So you could actually just append the block. Yeah, and this would be a problem. And that's why usually, I mean, this construction at some point wasn't, even though it can be secure, it was not so, it became less popular, and a popular construction to address this length extension issue was, or is still HMAC. And what does it do? Basically, it does 2 layers of this construction. So you have your master key, you derive 2 subkeys from it. And then in the first step, yeah, you just do this construction that I just discussed. So you prepend the key, hash it, and then you take the digest, prepend the second key, and hash it again. Yeah. So that was intended to prevent this issue. And you can again show that if you use a hash function that is ideal, yeah, then this is a secure MAC. But of course, it's a big assumption that we have a hash function which is ideal. Now, another construction of keyed hash functions is a universal hash function. So this is a bit different. So this is a bit the analogy with the one-time paths that we had for encryption. So there is also a perfectly secure way to build message authentication, or a universal, or a keyed hash function. But it requires, in principle, that every time that you hash a message, you use a new random key. Yeah. And so one example of this is that actually, suppose I have a message with blocks xi. So I can actually take a polynomial whose coefficients are these message blocks. Again, I interpret these message blocks as elements of a finite field, for example. And then I evaluate this polynomial in the secret key. Yeah. And So if you want to see whether this is collision resistant, so you would need that this output Y, yeah, is the same for two different messages. But for this to happen, yeah, the key needs to be a root of the polynomial. Yeah, but it's a polynomial of degree d, so this allows you to bound the number of roots. Yeah, and this gives you a bound on the collision probability. But yeah, this is so you can do that, but in practice, yeah, because it's a one-time thing, you actually would derive those keys from another key using a block cipher typically. So usually when you use this, it's a combination of a block cipher to derive the key, or sometimes also to protect the output of the universal hash. Yeah, so this is an example of a MAC function based on the universal hash function. So you generate keys K1 and K2 for using, for example, a block cipher. So block cipher you can use to build a pseudo-random number generator, which you can use to make these keys. And then you apply just the universal hash function with a certain key, and you add this second key to the output. Now, usually you do not want only encryption or only authentication. So actually, yeah, that's in the past, people often just used, for example, encryption, but then it turned out that this gave problems, especially when you can do, well, as an attacker, you can manipulate the ciphertext, and then the user will decrypt this. Yeah, but if the user doesn't know that this ciphertext is actually not generated by the legitimate other party, by Alice, then this gives you all sorts of problems. Yeah, so you usually also actually need authentication, and that's why the more modern thing is to combine these two definitions into a single concept that's called authenticated encryption. And you can build authenticated encryption by combining an encryption mode and a MAC. That's one way to do it. If you do this, usually, I mean, unless you do careful analysis, you need the encryption mode and the MAC to use different independent keys. Otherwise, you can't guarantee that when you put them together, it's still secure. But yeah, so more recently, there's a number of standards also that give you a sort of combined scheme for doing this authenticated encryption. So it will produce ciphertext and also a tag at the same time. So this is an example of an authenticated encryption mode. So it's you take counter mode for the encryption, yeah, and then you compute the tag using this CBC MAC that we already saw before. Yeah, so that's so here. This is the encryption, and then the tag is produced using CBC MAC. Here. Yeah. Another example is OCB. So OCB is a bit like ECB, but it's actually secure. And the reason is so you do put the message into the block cipher, but you actually XOR first something here, which depends on the key and on the nonce. So you, yeah, it's basically what you are doing with this is you turn these block ciphers into slightly different block ciphers, actually, if you view the combination of these XORs with the block cipher. So you don't really use the same, yeah, it's called a tweakable block cipher that you make by combining these three operations. And then you can basically have a different cipher essentially for each call. And here the MAC is computed from a checksum of the messages. And then you again add this key dependent and nonce or IV dependent value, and then you encrypt it, and this after truncation is the tag. There's more examples. So this is counter modes combined with a universal hash function based MAC. Yeah? So that's, for example, what's used in GCM. So that's, if you look at actual usage in TLS, that's the most widely used approach actually. So it's just putting, so you compute the ciphertext and then you do a MAC on the ciphertext. So this is computing this polynomial, basically, and evaluating it in the key. That's what this does. Yeah, and then you add here another key. Yeah, and that's the tag. So maybe we still have a few minutes just to say something about permutation-based cryptography. So yeah, I mentioned so far stream ciphers and block ciphers. Now, for some applications like a hash function without a key, yeah, you don't really need to have a block cipher. Block cipher is something that actually was intended to be used with a key. But since for these applications we don't need it, you could also just decide to get rid of the key and just build a permutation. And that's this idea of permutation-based cryptography. So here the starting point, the underlying building block, is just an invertible mapping, which is not secret, but it's still supposed to be unstructured. Yeah, that's a bit what that means, depends on how you're going to use it. And yeah, if you think about it, in some ways it simplifies things, yeah, because you're getting rid of sort of one of the inputs of the basic building block. So the SHA-3 hash function is an example of how you can use permutations. There it's used to build an unkeyed primitives. I will show later how you can build a keyed primitive as well. So here this f, that's just a permutation. But yeah, it's clear that this permutation, it must be, for example, if you know part of the output here, it shouldn't be easy to compute part of the input. Yeah? Something like, I need this to be unstructured. Yeah, in the case of SHA-3, the permutation f is actually Ketchuk, and it operates on a 3D state. I'll just go very quickly through this. So this is a state which is 5 by 5, and then in the depth you have a number of bits that corresponds usually to the machine word length. So for example, 64 bits. And then you do operations sometimes on these so-called lanes. Yeah? So these are these lanes, or you do combinations between the different lanes. So you have also again an S box, and then some linear operations as well, but I'll skip this too because we're almost out of time. You can also use permutations not just to build unkeyed modes, but you can also use it to build, for example, authenticated encryption. This is an example of the duplex construction. So what you do here, you will actually, not every detail is shown here, but you start from a constant initial state, then you will absorb at some point your key into this state. Yeah. And then after you've absorbed the key, you will you will each time absorb a message block. Let's say sigma 1 could be a message block, and then apply the permutation and then extract a ciphertext block. I mean, not a ciphertext block, but you can. So yeah, for authentication, you put in the message blocks, and then at some point you extract a tag block, basically. Yeah, and for encryption, you can use this thing to generate a key stream. So you can use it. You can, after you put in all the contexts, so you can use it for authenticated encryption. So just to end, so what are some challenges in symmetric cryptography? So there's a bunch of things that actually work quite well. One thing to point out is that none of the primitives have actually been proven secure. Yeah? So that's a thing that many people are still working on. Yeah? How can you build these block ciphers or hash functions in a way that you can actually give a security argument? Yeah? And this gets quite complicated because you need to analyze very deeply how they work. There's also a need to design primitives for various different applications. Yeah? Because, I mean, we have, for example, AES, it's used very widely, but AES is not the best choice maybe in all circumstances. So There was, for a while, quite a lot to do about lightweight ciphers. That means, for example, in a situation where you need to minimize the energy that you use, or you have to have something that you can evaluate in a single cycle, so low latency. And more recently, there's also a need for ciphers that work within a specialized environment. So, for example, if you are using, if you want to use something like multi-party computation, and you want to have a cipher that you can efficiently evaluate inside of an MPC protocol, then you might want a specialized cipher that is more efficient for this setting. Okay, that concludes this lecture.